All right, today we're going to discuss the quest of the historical Jesus. Now, when we were discussing the creeds in the early church, after, those first councils that kind of defined who Jesus was, defined how the two natures work together, it was pretty much a settled issue for the vast majority of people. So they really just took the rest. Everything else is kind of built on that foundation, even when you get to the Reformation. So there was no real Christological crisis which emerged until the last few hundred years with the Enlightenment. Now, what is the Enlightenment? Well, the Enlightenment isn't like a single thing. It's several philosophical ideas that were arising in the 18th century. And what was driving those ideas was an emphasis on reason as the ultimate arbitrator of determining what is true or false or good or whatever. So there was this belief that truth was universal and that we could use reason to penetrate and get to what that ultimate truth was. And that ultimate truth is considered to be not only universal but eternal, so good for all times and places. So it's not so much the use of reason, because it's also called the Age of Reason, that really differentiates it. It's the use of reason that's independent from any other authorities. So you had ecclesiastical authorities, you had familial authorities, you had civil authorities, but now with a turn to the self that we really saw emerging after Descartes' I think, therefore I am. So it's kind of the turn to the self that starts to make these determinations. It's about my use of reason, independent of other authorities that tell me what it is that I should believe. And of course, Christianity ends up falling under the microscope of the Enlightenment. Why? Because many of the claims of Christianity are inconsistent with what the Enlightenment believed was reasonable and rational. Let's say the miracles, for example, or that people rise from the dead. These things don't happen. There's no way to prove those things happened. And so there's this great skepticism that arises in connection with certain claims that are made in the Christian faith. Well, along with this comes what will be termed much later by Albert Schweitzer, the quest of the historical Jesus. That is, that somehow we're going to have to separate the Jesus of faith from the Jesus of history, and that those two are not the same. All right? So what was also part of the Enlightenment was the scientific revolution. So and new discoveries that were being made in science. So the Enlightenment isn't just about using reason. It's coupled with certain philosophical beliefs as well, such as the belief in progress, the belief in science, and so forth. And as time goes on, there are going to be some reactions that don't necessarily throw the Enlightenment out, but kind of get, part of this philosophical development that happens over the last few centuries. And one of them, for example, is Romanticism, in which there's a kind of pushback against the ultra-rationalism of the Enlightenment that then begins to focus on my feelings, my experience. And we're going to see how this also figures in to the quest of the historical Jesus and different ideas about who Jesus is that are distinct from the Jesus of faith that we had seen over the last couple of centuries. All right. So along with the suspicion of miracles and the supernatural, also came the rise of the historical critical method. Now, if you've been here for very long, or even before you got here, you probably know what the historical critical method is. But it's a way of looking at the biblical text with this lens of critiquing, not just looking at it from a faith perspective, but who were the original authors? What was the context in which it developed? And so on and so forth. So we actually appropriate the historical critical method in evangelical, certainly at Fuller and in other places in evangelicalism. But how it's appropriated and used in terms of this quest is a little bit different. It's much more skeptical, much than the way that we would use that method in conjunction with a faith perspective, right? But what this does is the historical method, critical method, also has us look at the text not just as revelation, right? That it didn't just fall from the sky like the Quran is understood to fall from the sky, but that looking at it from this kind of development that occurs within the text and that's connected with human history and human interaction, right? But part of the fallout of that is the Bible starts to be regarded as just another book among other books to be explored and so forth. So it loses its privileged status as revelation, partly because even the idea of revelation itself comes into question. So, as I said, this is going to impact our Christology because many of the assumptions we make about who Jesus is, even the basic assumption in Orthodox Christianity that he's the Son of God, is going to come under fire because so many of those assertions that we make about Jesus and the very things that distinguish Jesus, that give support for the idea that he's the Son of God and not just another human being, are things like the resurrection and so forth. And since those are now cast into doubt, then who Jesus becomes also changes in light of that. Now, you may think, oh, but this is, how did we arrive where we have today in terms of how Jesus is regarded? Really starts with this Enlightenment philosophy and its impact on specifically what we call the quest of the historical Jesus. Okay. All right. There are many stages to this quest, and some of the stages are actually reactions against the original quest. But let's start first and foremost with the original quest. Some of the ways in which the quest developed were, already with the Enlightenment, there started to become this opposition to the creeds, the dogmatic creeds, which we've been exploring, which make these statements which are not in line with what is considered to be reasonable or rational from a Enlightenment perspective. So instead, what they try to do is reconstruct the life of Jesus from the Gospels, all right? Especially the original quest. And in doing so, they have a strong preference for the synoptics, right, rather than the book of John. Why? Because they think that the book of John and all the Pauline letters come more from a faith perspective and the synoptic gospels more from a history perspective. So there's a strong preference, especially for the book of Mark and for the Q source. If you don't know what the Q source is, that's okay. Not going to delve into that too much. It's considered to be another source from which the Gospels drew, okay, in addition to the book of Mark. So Mark is felt to be fundamental, and then the other Gospels drew from Mark and from Q, okay. Not important. If you've taken biblical studies, I'm sure you've come across this. My point is simply that think about the Gospels that they are looking at, and they're looking at the Gospels that really stress Jesus as a human being, right? Rather than the high Christology, which we find in the Pauline and Johannine texts, right? So, and then they also wanted to offer a psychological history of Jesus. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at the original quest. Basically, in a nutshell, what they're saying is that there is a discrepancy between the Jesus of faith, the Christ of faith, and the Jesus of history. Notice that Christ is a statement about who Jesus is, implies that he's more than just a human being, and Jesus, his humanity. So that's stress on the life of Jesus rather than the life of Christ, right? So there's this distinction that's made. All right. Now, in keeping with that, what we're also going to see as the quest unfolds is what is commensurate with the Enlightenment framework. What is it about Jesus that would fit well with the progression, the kind of optimism about human progress that is also part of the Enlightenment, and the strong turn towards the person. Well, in that case, what you're probably going to highlight about Jesus is what a good moral and ethical teacher that he was. And in fact, that is the direction to which a lot of these turn, and to which we still see this day in classical liberalism. All right, so so in that case, if we want to find out who Jesus really is, we have to go behind tradition, go behind faith statements about Christ, go behind the apostles, go even perhaps behind the disciples, and get to what they call the kernel of that is the real Jesus. Okay, so what we're trying to do is find the real Jesus behind the husk that has surrounded Jesus and built up these stories around him that have made him more than who he probably was. Okay. Well, consequently, as I said, you're going to downplay certain aspects of that you find. You're going to downplay things like the role of the cross and resurrection. For example, yes, you can say Jesus died, but the significance of his death, not so important, because these are faith statements and ways of looking at him through the eyes of faith after his death, and kind of which may be well. Anyway, I don't want to get too far ahead of the thing. So, but that is where we're going to move. All right. What you'll also notice is, as we talked about before, there are different approaches that we can take. We can start from above with the Christological statements about Christ, and start from that perspective, from that faith perspective, starting from Revelation, or you can start from below with human experience and history. Well, this is a radical approach from below. There's really no recognition of any from above that is coming into this, and but it is not like Pannenberg's from below approach. And the reason for this is, we'll turn to Pannenberg later, but I've hinted at it before. Pannenberg does unlike the Enlightenment, which automatically ruled out certain things a priori before you could even start your discussion. We already know miracles don't happen. We already know people don't rise from the dead. On and on. Anything which didn't fit with what it is that seems to be rational, right? It's thrown out. Pannenberg doesn't start that way. Pannenberg says we can't rule out miracles. We can't rule out resurrection. We can't rule these things out a priori. Therefore, even though Pannenberg starts from human history, because he says we've got to connect our beliefs with what God has done in history, all right? He ends up with a high Christology, largely because he thinks that the resurrection, there's good evidence for the resurrection. And he doesn't throw out all those other things which would automatically be tossed out in these earlier quests of the historical Jesus. So they end up with what we call a low Christology. A low Christology focuses on the humanity of Christ. A high Christology focuses on the divinity of Christ. And as I've said before, it's important that we hold these in balance, because an overemphasis on one or an overemphasis on the other both lead to what I think are distortions of faith in the faith, and distortions of who Jesus is. All right. So, sorry, I just accidentally popped way ahead, and I didn't mean to do that. Give me just a second to find my place here. I don't know how that happens, but all right. So let's start with the conflict between faith and history. And really, Alistair McGrath has noted basic elements in this conflict, 3 basic elements in this conflict. Now, what I mean by elements is the conflicts between faith and history are what the quest is proposing. They're saying here are 3 problems, major problems that can be defined. Now, not everybody in the quest is lining it up just like this. It's just that these are things that you can identify from the quest in general, okay? Now, what's very interesting about this is, I think, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but I think that this kind of division of history and faith is rather naive, because underlying what we're going to explore here about their way that they view history is that somehow we can objectively determine history. Well, what we know now, thanks to postmodernism, and I'm not saying that postmodernism doesn't have issues. It has really big issues. But one of the things we can thank postmodernism for is the recognition of the subjective nature with which we appropriate everything around us. There is no other way to appropriate something other than through our experience and through our lens, through our subjective lens. So, the reality is there is no objective history. I mean, history is always interpreted history, right? And that interpretation is always through the particular lens through which we're looking. And boy, can you really see this in the quest of the historical Jesus, when there are certain assumptions that are made, and that colors all of the results in terms of who is the real Jesus. The assumptions already determine the end. So, all right. So here are the basic elements. There are really three in the conflict: a chronological, a metaphysical, and an existential difficulty that is being outlined. The first is what we call the chronological issue, which is there's a distance between the past and the present. And because there's such a distance, we can't say that there's a reliability to the gospel accounts. There's no way that we can magically go back in time, access videos and and know exactly what happened in that time. And let me tell you, even if we had a video camera, that's not objective either. If you'll notice, a video always takes pictures within the parameters of that part of the lens. It doesn't give you the big picture of things. I know I go off track a little bit. I remember once seeing a picture, a black and white picture, and it was a room full of people, and they were screaming in what looked like terror. Their faces were distorted. They were like, it really looked like, there was like something terrible was happening in the room. Then the next picture expands, and I think it was, now I feel so bad. Like, I really don't know what I'm talking about. But I believe it was Elvis Presley. And it was either Elvis Presley or the Beatles. I can't remember which, but I think it was Elvis Presley. And now you have context for what it was, and you realize, no, they weren't screaming in terror. So the reality is that even if you had a video camera, the video camera is always going to capture a part of what's going on. It's never going to capture the totality of everything, right? So the point is, I'm not trying to agree with classical liberalism. I'm simply saying even their own quest is going to have its limitations, is what I'm trying to get at. So how should we regard the reliability of the narrative of the resurrection? Since we can't verify the gospel accounts, how reliable are the eyewitnesses, for example? So we have this chronological issue, which was there's too great a distance between the past and the present here. The second, which is kind of a big one, is a metaphysical difficulty. And that is, how can the history of Jesus of Nazareth give us some kind of access to universal truth? And I mentioned this before, just because you can say that there's proof of divinity, or that Jesus happened, or all these things happened. Let's say that we could even say those things happened. How do we make the next leap to what this means, not only for this time and place, but how do we say that this has universal significance? So now, Lessing, who we're going to look at in just a little bit, spoke of an ugly great ditch between the truths of history that we find and the truths of reason. And therefore, there's a huge gulf between history and faith. So that's one of the metaphysical difficulties. And then you have an existential difficulty, which is simply, okay, let's say that Jesus is all of these things. What does that mean to me? All right? So maybe Jesus rose from the dead, but how can I make the leap now to saying that make that leap from he rose from the dead, he's the Son of God, and now that has relevance for me. How do we make these leaps looking at history? And what does this have to do with me? So even if it could be historically proving, what is the relevance to a modern person? So these are three difficulties that arise that the quest is going to, or difficulties which the quest is going to raise up in regards to historical Jesus. All right. Now remember in the backdrop, as we look at the beginnings of the quest, that already we see the seeds in the deism of the 17th and 18th century for a critical look at the Gospels. Remember, until this time, yes, you may have had critics throughout time, but the vast majority of people just took the Bible for granted. They took the teachings for granted. They took the faith statements for granted. Now all of that is being called into question. Now, the rationalist critique of I don't know how to pronounce his name, Gotthold Lessing, exemplifies this conflict between the Jesus of faith the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. So, he's the one who termed that ugly great ditch that I talked about. Hold on one second. Jesus, he focuses on the idea that Jesus is a human being, and that for example, that John's Christology is not based in history. And he also talks about the difference between facts that occur and the interpretations of those facts. So you could look at the life of Jesus, but clearly those facts are interpreted by his disciples in one way that going back and looking at it from a modern perspective may take you to a different conclusion. All right? But he's not the one I really want to focus on here. I really want to focus on someone that... hold on one second. Okay. All right. Yeah, we are going in the right place. I really want to focus on Reiermaß, because Reiermaß was radically critical of who Jesus was as the Jesus of faith. Now, Lessing, a little more mild, but he's the one who publishes what are called the fragments that come from Reiermaß, because if Reiermaß had published them during his lifetime, he was quite worried about what the reaction would be. So they were actually published posthumously because it's such a radical critique and it's so dismissive of the Jesus of faith that obviously that it would provoke a reaction, basically. And it did. So, but here's the thing. Reiermaß had an agenda. He wanted to show how shaky the foundations of Christianity and Judaism really were. So he wrote a book, which did come out, called An Apology for the Rational Worshipper of God, in which he subjects the Bible under a radical critique. And like I said, it was later published posthumously. Very, very strongly influenced by English deism and its assumptions, he focuses on Jesus just as a human being and sees him in purely understood purely in human terms. So for him, Jesus is just a Jew in continuity with his culture. So if you want to understand the kingdom of God in Jesus's preaching, then we have to understand it from this Jewish context, but within a human context, not within, and a political context, not a context of seeing Jesus in as any kind of divinity. So he argued that there's a radical discrepancy between the intentions of Jesus and of those of the early church. Now notice what we've said here. We haven't just said that there's a discrepancy. He takes it a step further by saying this discrepancy is intentional. Jesus had his own agenda, and then the people that followed Jesus, the disciples and followers after that, had their intentions that they wove into the story of Jesus. All right? So, for him, Jesus was merely an apocalyptic messianic visionary, but he was a failed one. And his disciples, when they realize he's failed, and what's the ultimate failure? He gets crucified. All right? And so they realize, oh gosh, here we have this guy who was going to be our messianic hope, who was going to be the one who freed us from oppression, and he's dead. Shoot. Okay, but the movement isn't over yet. Maybe we can still, we can still salvage it. So what we'll do is we'll reinterpret all of these events, and we'll talk about, for example, the idea of a redemption, a spiritual redemption. Will include concepts such as the resurrection of the dead. So, what do they do to justify their reinterpretation and to deliberately spread this lie? Is that they steal the body of Jesus, right? You've heard that, I'm sure, before. That wasn't new. That was something that in the first century that they were talking about, right? But he says, no, they stole the body and created a new story based on this messianic vision of Jesus, but in a reinterpreted format. So Christianity isn't the result of Jesus's teaching, because he failed. He was going to be this great deliverer, and he failed. So now you have a spiritual reinterpretation that the disciples know very well isn't true, but that's what gets propagated. Now, for him, then, not only were the disciples mispresenting the meaning of Jesus, but they were also frauds, since they claimed spiritual authority on the basis of their claims to Jesus' resurrection and miracles. How do we know they're frauds and they deliberately lied? Because there are no such things as miracles and resurrection. Therefore, we know that they lied, right? So it's a deliberate mispresentation. Basically, the accounts that they make are a way to cover the embarrassment of Jesus' death. That means that the New Testament is riddled with interpolations that are laid on top or intermingled with Jesus' real teachings to make him to create this retelling of who Jesus was. All right. So, therefore, the end result is that a fictitious Christ replaces the Jesus of history. You can see why maybe he wanted, this was best that it was published posthumously. So then, for Reimeros, Jesus then is seen in those purely human terms, a Jew who preached the kingdom of God as a political kingdom, and he had these messianic pretensions, which he ultimately failed in the political revolution that he was hoping that he would start. But you say, okay, that's a lot there. But what he does is that radical approach to looking at Jesus lays the groundwork for the quests that are going to follow, which subject the Bible to similar critique and assessment, right? And what we see is this very strong distinction which arises between the legitimate history of Jesus as a human being. That's legitimate. What is fictitious is the Christ of faith, which are the stories that are built up around Jesus. Okay? So that's the thread that you're going to see, especially in this original quest, all right, of the historical Jesus. So, now, it was Lessing who published those fragments by Reimeros, right? So, and for both Lessing and Reimeros, although Lessing was much more toned down, he didn't have quite this radical position that especially disciples are liars, deliberate liars. He didn't have that. But what is common is that what you have is a human testimony of biblical text that is contradicted by the present day experience. And because of that disjunction which we see, we have to re-examine the Bible in light of modernist assumptions. And what I mean by that is there's a particular way that they're looking at history. There's a particular way that they're looking at rationality and reason. And the idea that when we look at history, they had a particular understanding of history, which is that there's a homogeneity to it. So if people don't rise from the dead today, they didn't arise from the dead 2,000 years ago. Since we know that people don't rise from the dead today, then people did not rise from the dead 2,000 years ago. So you can see how these assumptions are at work. Okay? So both of them were trying to find a basis for a rational religion. So they weren't trying to get rid of religion completely, but they were trying to have this, and this is true of a lot of the people in the quest, a religion that is in line with the Enlightenment thinking about what's rational and reasonable. Speaking of rational and reasonable, as I said, it is that itself we probably should be calling into question. This is a side note, throwing it in for free. Because what postmodernism has showed us, and which we kind of were getting beforehand, before this, is that we see that rationality is not universal. And even our rationality is strongly influenced by our particular context. There's a great book by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, Whose Justice, Whose Rationality? I think that's what it's called. I might have the phrase just a little bit off. But the point is that we think of rational as rational within our particular context, and then we apply that universally when that in fact may not at all be the case. And the other thing is, it's quite interesting to assume that of course we know that people were used reason beforehand. I don't think that many of the Enlightenment thinkers would say that, oh, Augustine never used reason, but they would say that what differentiates the Enlightenment is that the use of reason is something which comes from the person, independently of anything else. Okay, and they're even going to, what we're going to see is there's even going to be disparagement of, the way that people thought in the like they were ignorant in the first century. And we'll get to that later. That's a particular thinker. Not all the thinkers are thinking like this, but you'll see all of this is arising from the same place, which is that radical critique of the Enlightenment. Okay, that comes from the Enlightenment assumptions. All right, that takes us to classical liberalism. And the reason is classical liberalism arises, classical liberalism is still alive today. You'll find classical liberalism in many churches, actually, and that might surprise you, because for some of you, maybe not all of you, may be surprised to find that there are many churches that are out there that don't believe Jesus was actually the Son of God, but still call themselves Christian churches, even within some of the mainline denominations. So just be aware that can occur. So, but there are certain features of classical liberalism, and classical liberalism very much is connected to Enlightenment thinking and kind of evolutions of thought that have come, but are rooted in that Enlightenment thinking. So you'll find a lot of the things that I'm saying today, you're thinking, oh yeah, but those are things from 200 years ago. They're not. These are the roots of thinking that took us to the place where we are today, which is why I've included several videos that are contemporary, so you can see how what the contemporary thinkers are saying relates back to all the things that we're talking about right now. So, all right, background. Some of the features of classical liberalism, I'm going to move away from persons to kind of this idea, is they draw from not only the Enlightenment, but from other movements that were surrounding that time period, especially a little bit still overlapping with the Enlightenment, but partly pushing back against some of that, some of the Enlightenment. And that I mentioned already, Romanticism is doing that by now, kind of focusing on feelings and experience. And in addition to that, you have humanism, which has an incredibly optimistic view of human beings, fueled by certain findings in science, like Darwinianism and other things, which seem to indicate that we're on this upward trajectory. We're getting better and better. We're getting more and more enlightened. We're moving forward in progress. And then, bam, the 20th century hits them, and you have World War I, World War II, mass genocide, atomic bomb. Yeah, so much for that incredible upward progress that we were making. I find it so amazing and not disconnected. If you really explore philosophy, I'm not going to connect all the dots for you now, but isn't it interesting that Nazi Germany arose out of one of the most enlightened cultures, intellectual milieus of the day, which was Germany? Many of these thinkers are coming from Germany. So interesting, isn't it? But there's reasons for that, and none of those are going to be covered right now. Aren't you lucky? Okay, so all right. Now, another thing that we're going to see in classical liberalism is that focus on the humanity of Jesus, right? That low Christology is something that characterizes classical liberalism. But not only is Jesus, okay, but you say, but Jesus is human, but what makes him special? When in a lot of classical liberalism, what makes him special is the degree to which he was open to God, okay? And so what you end up is what we're going to mention later in the class is what you mentioned. You end up with kind of a degree or a functional Christology, that Jesus functioned in a degree that's different from most of us, but which is possible. Like, it's because he's a human like us. So he's just a human being, but his openness to God was such that he was able to function at a much higher degree than most of us. And that's what makes him such an extraordinary ethical teacher, a moral example, and so on. All right. So far, so good? All right. Hey, I know this is a lot of stuff, and it may seem abstract to you, but this has concrete. If you talk to the man on the street whose primary understanding of Jesus are the specials that he's seen on TV, you'll understand that why this matters. You'll understand that it's important to understand that when you utter the word Jesus to somebody, what you mean by Jesus is not the same thing that they understand Jesus to be, right? Even when you say Jesus is divine, everything that they're getting is not filtered from the same perspective. Heck, even among all of us in this class, it's not filtered from the same perspective. It's filtered from our denominational experience and from our personal experience. Still, it's important to understand, what do others, that comes back to that question I asked at the introduction. Who do people say that I am? That's what we're exploring, not just what, Orthodox Christians think, but who do others say that I am? And then the question needs to be turned back. Who do you think that Jesus is? Right? All right, enough of that. Let me just, one of the fathers of classical liberalism is Friedrich Schleiermacher. And this is still something that informs a lot of classical liberalism today. Basically, he's not, his focus was more on the person. We're not looking so much at, who Jesus was in relation to the divine. The focus comes on me, and on what is it that stimulates within me a proper dispositional feeling towards God, that creates the sense of awe and connection with God. So it doesn't just mean feelings in the sense of I just feel this way. It means to be oriented towards something that is infinite and eternal. So God exists, but what is the focus becomes not on God himself, but on my reaction or response to God. Do you see what I'm saying? That's where the focus lies. So the focus now moves towards what is happening with me rather than who God is. We doing okay so far? All right. So what makes Jesus so special then is what he called God consciousness. He had a much greater God consciousness so that he was oriented towards God in a particular way. He's still fully human, but what separates him from us is the level of God consciousness that he has. So again, we're talking about that degree, right? In which that's what separates Jesus from the rest of us. That's why we can elevate Jesus, but we elevate him as a human being. So it was a way to retain a kind of orthodoxy in regards to Jesus, but in a way that made sense to the contemporary period, which had, like I said, problems with things like Trinity. Really? You know, miracles? No, I don't think so. Resurrection? You've got to be kidding. All right. So, and certainly virgin birth. Ha 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 ha. All right. So all of these things are being rejected. And at the same time, it's important to note that he's not like Lesson and Reimeros, because he's not completely reductionist. He's retaining something important about Jesus, but trying to do that in a way that works with the contemporary situation. So, for Schleiermacher, as I said, religion is a matter of feeling or self-consciousness. Next slide. An authentic acknowledgement of one's dependence on something higher. And that's the feeling that's supposed to be produced within me, is this feeling of absolute dependence on God. So, what theology becomes then as an exposition on this feeling rather than a propositional factual account of historical events as we find in the pre-Enlightenment period. All right? So far, so good? Now, that effect on classical liberalism is going to be huge. So now, liberalism, as I said, represents a turn to the human subject and emphasizes immanentism rather than the transcendent. So look at classical theism. Go back to classical theism, and that, with that strong emphasis on this transcendent God. Well, they're not exploring that. That's not of interest in this mindset. What's of interest is what's happening with me in the here and now, what's happening to us, what's happening to human beings. So in that case, the Bible isn't so much it's not divine revelation anymore, but rather a human interpretation of religious experiences. So, continuing to next slide on classical liberalism. It's classical liberalism that is going to give impetus now to the quest for the religious personality of Jesus. So that's the next stage we're moving in. So before we were trying to look at the Jesus of history, we're still going to be doing that. But now we're also going to be looking at the religious personality of Jesus as part of that quest. So, all right. So in this quest, the religious personality becomes the main focus, and the divinity of Jesus relegated to margins. We already talked about that. Now, with this comes this confidence that we can get to some real account we can get to an account of the real Jesus, and we could write a religious biography of Jesus based on the gospel accounts when those gospel accounts are studied critically. So, all right, that's going to take us to the David Strauss and the lives of Jesus. All right, now, Strauss is critical of Reimeros's extreme rationalism, so you have to know that. And unlike Reimeros, he doesn't at all think the disciples were deliberately deceptive, but rather that their beliefs were distorted. Oh, darn. I jumped ahead a little bit, sorry. I hate when I do that. Give me a second. I don't even know how I do it. I just do it. All right. Sometimes I look down to make sure I didn't miss anything, and pow. Anyway, rather their beliefs were distorted in the retelling of the Jesus story. Okay, so he says, okay, the Christology of the Orthodox system with the idea of the resurrection, substitutionary death, and so forth, this is problematic to the liberal mindset. So, and he wasn't really so fond of Schleiermacher's median position. But like I said, neither has he taken the radical rationalist position of someone like Reimeros. So, what is he going to do then? Because we're still focusing now on the religious. Now we're kind of integrating this religious aspect of Jesus into this. Okay. Now, while he is explaining the meaning of Jesus apart from miracles and metaphysics, he wanted to show how faith in the resurrection emerges even though there's no historical basis. So, this is what is most important about Strauss. and that's his introduction of the idea of myth. All right? Now, a myth doesn't necessarily mean something is untrue in its conceptual result in terms of what it means, but it doesn't have to have a basis in history for it to have meaning. Okay? This also is influential even now in classical liberalism. Okay? But he's the one who introduces the concept. And in his mythological approach, faith in the resurrection is a matter of the subjective conception of the mind. A dead Jesus is resurrected because of a powerful spiritual experience. So now we have these powerful spiritual experiences that testify, or that certainly the early disciples did, that that result in a resurrection of a sort, but it's not a literal or a historical resurrection. So he sees resurrection from the disciples not so much as a fabrication as Reimarus did, but rather as an interpretation of Jesus' death and the significance of Jesus' life for those disciples. So he allowed for the use of mythical stories by the gospel writers, not because they're deceptions, but because that is the way the people in those times shared their powerful spiritual experiences. So they're not purposely being deceptive. That's just the language of the time that's being used. So it really is. So this concept of myth that is thoroughgoing, that informs everything that Strauss is doing, is what we are seeing today. Now, here it is. While the myths may not be historically true, the writers are not liars. What is important is that they communicate something. And so the task of the modern person, looking back at the Gospels, is to interpret the myths in a way that works with modernity's mindset. So, in this, then, it's not a challenge, like Reimarus, to the integrity of disciples, but it is a statement that says something which I find incredibly condescending. I try not to throw my personal opinions in too much, but I gotta say, really, folks, because this is what he says. You know, basically, it's a statement about their pre-modern mythical worldview. You have a primitive group culture that hasn't yet risen to the level of abstract conceptualization. So, because of that, this way of talking in terms of myths was acceptable, and the way that people commonly communicated. Of course, we may not believe in miracles now, but the stories do say something about the way in which God cares, and for us, he heals, he feeds, and expresses the cultural idea that God intervenes. So then, his view allows us to appropriate the truths of the Bible, but in keeping with the modern mindset, right? Well, you know, he's doing better. But, you know, at the end of the day, I do think that people in that time probably knew the difference between a truth and a falsehood, a myth and a historical event, and knew how to speak about it in those terms. I'm just saying, you know, even a person in that time can figure out whether or not someone truly has risen from the dead. Okay, just a thought. Anyway, you know, it's the arrogance of the present that always sees the past as somehow it's that mistake of, well, I think there's something that's still very much that many of us think. I'm not going to include you in that. Let's say the us of the world, the us of the West especially, that sees things in terms of human progress. And we always know more now than we did then. And people in the past were more ignorant than we are because we're the more enlightened. I don't think that's true. I think there's, you know, it's a failure to understand that people are able to be reasonable and rational within their own contexts, in their own times and places. But, okay. Yes, there are some things we discover and that we know better, like discoveries in science and medicine. But we have to be very careful to consider people in the past to be ignorant. Anyway, when we make those statements. Okay, all right, let's move on to other themes, such as Strauss's understanding of the incarnation. For him, the incarnation is one of the biggest obstacles to rational religion, which goes back to Hegel. I'm just going to say he was very influenced by Hegel, and I'm not going to get too much into that. But he does speak about almost like we have a spark of the divine within us. So if you're going to look at the incarnation, all right, and you look at something like the idea of the divine-human union, Strauss would say something like, it makes more sense to apply it to the whole of humanity than one particular person. That is, all of us, in a sense, have that divine spark, for example. So instead of thinking about the incarnation as an event with application to this one person, perhaps we need to think about it more in terms of its application to humankind generally. Okay. Give me a second here, because I did it again. This is what happens when I use my iPad and I accidentally push a button. Okay. All right. Okay, as a result, all right, so back to the importance of myth. While the myths are not historically, okay, so we've already been there. All right, touched on that. All right, so the result is in the lives of Jesus, in which these lives of Jesus tended to see Jesus through a more humanistic lens, examining Jesus' social outlook than focusing on Jesus' divinity. All right, what about some other themes? I already talked about that. Okay, sorry, I went backwards and forward. My apologies on that. Now I want to introduce another thinker, Albert Ritschl. Now, I know all these peoples are getting blurred in your brain. It's okay. What I want you to understand is the progress of thinking that is occurring, because many of these thinkers are bringing out points that are still points that are raised today in classical liberalism and for those people who aren't Christians at all. So that's why it's important to understand this, and I want you to see this train of thought which emerges and how we end up at the final place where we are now. Okay, so that's why we're following these key thinkers, but I just want you to understand this conceptual moves that are happening and the direction towards which they're going. All right. By the way, you don't. I put the dates there because it's helpful to understand, to see the dates, but really I'm trying to get you to understand the concept. So anyway, along comes Albrecht Ritschl, who talks about the kingdom of God. And what he does is he offers a radical reinterpretation of let me see. Let me start that again. He offers a reinterpretation of the kingdom of God. So it's not as it has been proposed but typically in Orthodox Christianity as a radical transformation at the end of the ages. But rather, the idea is that the kingdom of God is about the unity of humanity organized according to love. So again, notice the turn to the subject. Notice that we're this radically from below perspective that we're getting here. This is very much in keeping with the immanentism that I was talking about. So this makes, instead of thinking about it as a transformation of the ages, the kingdom of God is brought to the present to say that it is an ethical, this worldly reality, not something which is going to apocalyptically happen at the end of time or at the end of the ages. So, what about the divinity of Jesus? So differently from the past, for him, he's not talking about what makes Jesus unique is not his divinity, but his unique vocation that was given to him by the Father in affecting our salvation. Now, even the way salvation is understood is going to be different, isn't it? If if you're kind of throwing out this whole concept of Jesus and spiritual redemption and all of that, this is going to change the notion of salvation as well. Jesus then fulfills perfectly the ideal of the kingdom of God. So he's showing us, so here's what we're getting. We're getting a turn to ethics. What is Jesus? A great moral teacher. What is the kingdom of God? A great ethical kingdom, right? So the newness of Jesus is really in his unique religious consciousness, which is something that Schleiermacher talked about as well. So what is Jesus doing? Jesus is working for the establishment of unity of humanity around the concept of love. All right, some final points about this stage of the quest. All right, I should probably look at my notes if I do this, huh? I really, all right. All right. Give me a second here. I so was not looking at my notes that I have no idea where I am in my notes, which is rather problematic, isn't it? Okay. I do apologize. Yeah. All right. Skip the final thoughts. I can't find them. I don't have any final thoughts. I actually do have final thoughts, but it's on the entire project. So why don't we move on to the collapse of the original quest and liberal Christologies. Whatever was in my brain to say that, I have no idea. So, all right. Now, here's what's interesting. That quest is going to be really strongly critiqued. But what's important for you to understand about these critiques is these are not evangelical critiques. These are not even critiques from Orthodox Christianity. They're actually critiques of classical liberalism from a non-evangelical perspective that's still very much working within some of the modernist assumptions. So just keep that in mind. Still, it's quite interesting how this critique takes place. So there are three kinds of critiques that are going to result in the collapse of this original quest that we saw emerging from the strongest period of the Enlightenment. The apocalyptic, the skeptical, and the dogmatic. Now, in terms of the apocalyptic, it's going to be emphasized that, look, you know, you guys completely ignored the apocalyptic nature of what Jesus said. When he was speaking apocalyptically, he really meant it. And when he was talking eschatologically, he really meant it. That isn't just a fabrication. So the thoroughly eschatological nature of Jesus' preaching, yes, it cannot be reconciled with the modernist liberal picture of Jesus just as an ethical teacher. So we have to take seriously that, because that's even part of the background of the Jewish apocalypticism of the time. So we can't simply dismiss that in Jesus' preaching. So there's a couple key figures in this, Johannes Weiss and Albert Schweitzer. So for Johannes Weiss, next slide, I should probably say that the whole time, sorry. He talks about Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom of God, that the kingdom of God in the liberal interpretation is a mispresentation of the radical apocalyptic preaching of the kingdom of God in Jesus' ministry. So the quest, the original quest then, is a false modernization of Jesus' teaching that truly was otherworldly, and you cannot read the New Testament apart from the Jewish apocalypticism that informed Jesus' preaching. Because the Jews really did have a heightened expectation of God's intervention, and Jesus' preaching reflects that. This is really, really underscored in the writings of Albert Schweitzer. If his name sounds familiar to you, yes, he is the Albert Schweitzer who was the doctor who went into Africa. He was an accomplished musician, and yes, apparently he did some theology too. Yes, he also won the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, in 1955 or something. So yes, that Albert Schweitzer. Now, this is a man who puts his money where his mouth is, so to speak. Because this is what he said. He argued that everything about Jesus' preaching and ministry was eschatologically conditioned. You cannot understand apart from that. So unlike liberalism, who's this really nice guy, right? Ethical teacher, high five, man. He presents Jesus, Schweitzer presents Jesus as a strange figure, an unknown person, an uncomfortable person, not this nicely sanitized version of Jesus that we see in the earlier quest. So he talks about, next slide, that thoroughgoing eschatology, the relationship to Jesus to Jewish eschatology, which I noted, and he talks about Jesus is in this kingdom of God to which he calls us, this eschatological kingdom. He calls us to radically forsake everything for the sake of the kingdom and the infinite value of the kingdom. So rather than just being an ethical improvement that we saw in the earlier quest, the kingdom is an apocalyptic end-time transformation for Jesus. Now, however, Schweitzer is still a child of his time. So he says, well, Jesus may have believed this, but the end times aren't really coming. This is just what Jesus thought, but he was mistaken, clearly, because the end times haven't come, have they? But he still thinks that Jesus' influence is important because of his notion of forsaking all for the kingdom of God and what that means. And he does, doesn't he, Schweitzer? If you know the story of Schweitzer, he really does forsake everything for the kingdom. He does that. So he says then that there's a value in discipleship even if the end did not come exactly as Jesus expected it. He was mistaken, but that doesn't mean there isn't value to that concept of discipleship. So, next slide. Since the Gospels are theological rather than historical interpretations, we have a hard time in getting access to the real history of Jesus. So in this kind of skepticism that we're going to see, we're moving to skeptical criticisms away from, Schweitzer's was apocalyptic. Now we're moving to skeptical criticism, which is the kind of the next stage of criticism, or the next aspect. We can't get access to the real history of Jesus. The very tools that the quest was using, the original quest, are now being turned against them to say the quest never had the tools to really get to the husk, to get to the kernel that's behind the husk. So that takes us to the work of Wilhelm Fried. I don't know how to pronounce it. Fried. Moving right along. That even Mark, the shortest gospel, is a theological interpretation of history. We can't pull apart the theological and the historical from those accounts, because even the historical has been colored by the theological interpretation, and we just can't pull them apart from each other. So in that sense, then, we can't recover the historical Jesus because we can't pull apart that theological interpretation from that historical Jesus. So these must be understood as religious histories. Now, what's going to happen is that what is being said here in terms of skepticism is going to be taken by later liberals to say, well, because they're theological then, they're not historically reliable. Ha ha ha. But that's a leap that isn't fair to make, because what an evangelical would respond is that just because a document is religious doesn't mean it's not in keeping with historical facts. They made a leap unnecessarily there. So even John's highly theological text, highly Christological text, still emerges from within a history, right, and is connected to that history. So the third form of criticism is dogmatic criticism. And they say basically the quest was doomed to fail because it was an exercise in futility, because the critical historical method is not equipped to deal with super historical claims. Like that, and that gets to the heart of, look, there are all kinds of claims that are being made which you a priori threw out in your examination. So what you end up is either ignoring those super historical aspects like miracles or so forth, or denying them. And when you do that, you end up saying, the proponents of the quest end up saying more about themselves and about their own assumptions, such that Jesus is different only in degree, and their own desires in reading back into the Gospels than it does with the Gospels themselves. Great critique, by the way, in my thinking. And one of those that does such a thorough and wonderful job at this dogmatic critique is Martin Kohler. And this is what he writes. This historical Jesus of modern writers conceals the living Christ from us. The Jesus of the life of Jesus movement is merely a modern example of a brainchild of human imagination. It is no better, it's no improvement on the dogmatic Christ of Byzantine Christology. For him, they're both removed from the real Christ. So what you end up with, according to Kohler, is these liberal scholars, or the liberal quest, coming up with a fifth gospel of Jesus, which says more about them than it does about Jesus. And indeed, we're going to look at that specifically when we look at an excerpt or a rewriting of the gospel from the Jesus Seminar, which is a more contemporary expression. It is a contemporary expression. Right now, it's still in existence, of the trajectory towards which all of this has been moving us. All right. So back to final thoughts. Hey, there really are final thoughts here. All right. So final thoughts. All right. Let's talk about both the significance and the problems with the quest. I've really put all of these down. I stole a lot of these. So Dr. Karkanen writes about this himself. I don't know if it's in the book that you have or not. But in terms of the significance, some good stuff here. Attempt to ascertain the historical validity of the Christian faith. The desire to make the Christian faith understandable to the modern person, which in itself is not a bad thing. Need to free Jesus from the confines of ecclesiastical prison. So they wanted to look at Jesus and see if they could kind of figure out where Christian tradition, if there was a way to understand how Christian tradition had influenced and impacted the Christ of the Jesus of history. Okay, there's something to be said about that too. It helps Christian theology adopt a historical critical methodology, even among those who would oppose the agenda of the quest. And actually, the historical critical method is helpful, but it is affected by the assumptions that we bring to the methodology, as we can see. And practical, it becomes immensely popular, and you should know this, in general opinion outside of Orthodox Christianity. Hugely popular. Just, as I keep saying, just look at the specials that are on television, and you will see a lot of this in those specials. All right. There are some problems. All right. And some of those problems have to do with it becomes a bedrock for pluralist and current liberal thinking of Hick and others. And the same criticisms, which can be applied to that later thinking, can also be applied to the quest. It has a very naive view of history. I mentioned this before. Mostly one because of the subjective nature of history, but also because they make it look as if we have an independent access to history apart from our own interpretations. And then this faith-history dualism that's so typical of the Enlightenment, that it's the either-or thing that's going on here, rather than understanding that there is a connection between that the faith of, maybe it's not so easy, and maybe we have to be careful to divorce the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith, and that Christianity is a historical religion at the end of the day. Next slide. They also have a very selective reading of the New Testament. Not that we're not all perhaps guilty of that. We all have canons within a canon. But basically they throw out anything that isn't in line with what they think is possible. So some of the most important letters, gospel, writings of the New Testament aren't even considered. Okay, so in that sense, their selective reading is no more neutral than other readings of the gospel. There's clearly a very strong prejudice against traditional Christianity, and in that, we have to understand that it's a protest movement. And as I think I might have mentioned before, anytime something is a reaction or a protest movement, it becomes limited because it allows itself to be defined in contradistinction to what it's protesting. All right? And it has an inadequate understanding of the development of doctrine and dogma, as if history did not play a role in the development. The Nicene Creed didn't happen in a vacuum. The disciples didn't just pop up with all of these things. The development does take into account history. The disciples lived with Jesus. How interesting to think that we can go back and say that we have a clearer picture of who Jesus is than the disciples did who lived with him. To not understand and then to fail to understand how that witness and how that testimony is part of the development of our dogma, well, anyway, is a failure to understand how dogma itself and doctrines develop. I'm going to skip this next slide. I like this quote from Alasdair Heron, which basically says, "We assign to Christ the place which our minds make for him," which is the very end of that quote. But he was referring to Arius back then. But now I'm saying, have we gone that far from what it is that those people at Athanasius and others were trying to counteract in their own time? Okay. Wow, you're probably thinking we really need a break. I'm thinking that we really need a break, but if you can just bear with me for just a little bit longer, this next part goes relatively quickly. We have entered into the next stage, very short, is called the New Quest. And the New Quest, Ernest Casamin is representative of this New Quest in the 20th century, where we've seen that after the Great War and after World War II, these things basically rip out the moral self-confidence of the Enlightenment. And so anyone who's writing in the 50s can see that is not going to have that same viewpoint which we had with the perhaps unfounded optimism of the 19th century. So I skipped the critique of Bultmann because we didn't really cover him. But for Ernest Casamin, he says the Gospels can really give us historical information concerning Jesus. He's not just a mythological figure that's unconnected to history. And there is a continuity between the preaching of Jesus and the preaching about Jesus. Are you feeling a little bit better now? Okay, I know I am. So that is going to lead. That's going to lead to the New Quest, and the New Quest is just basically saying that there is a connection between Jesus's eschatological message and the kerygma, the preaching of the early church. That's what kerygma means, right? Preaching or proclamation. But so now here, though, you say, well, gosh, aren't we getting closer to like where I am? Well, yes and no, because they're still going to concentrate primarily on Jesus rather than on the Christ. They're going to concentrate on Jesus and his person, right? On the message of, they're going to concentrate more on the humanity of Jesus and on his message than they are on the other aspects. Now, one of the interesting things that they're going to use is a tool called the criterion of dissimilarity. And how do we get back then? Because they still want to get back to the authentic sayings of Jesus. But how do we get to the authentic sayings of Jesus? Well, they think anything that caused a dissonance with what was common at the time must, or probably is an authentic saying of Jesus. All right? If in fact, because it would have been something that wouldn't have resonated with the understanding of the time. So if there is this kind of dissonance, then it would have been easier to not include that dissonance, but if they did, that probably then means it was an authentic teaching of Jesus. Okie dokie. That takes us to the third quest. Did I not say we were going to move very quickly? So the third quest, there is no unifying agenda, like the first two, the original quest and the new quest. Rather, the commonality is the claim that we can actually, through critical historical research, come to some understanding of who Jesus really was. So to do this, it's very important to look at his first century context, what was going on around Jesus at that time, because we can't understand Jesus apart from the context in which that surrounded him, and how this would have influenced his mission and his attentions. So you look at someone like N.T. Wright. By the way, he's the one who I believe he is the one who termed the third quest. He's going to mention that in the video, but others have attributed to him this the term third quest. So then we can use the study of historical Christian origins to find the meaning of Jesus within his Jewish context. That is, we can't tear Jesus apart from that Jewish context. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you end up with Orthodox Christianity at the end of the day. You're going to look at someone like Marcus Borg, who's going to talk about Jesus as the subversive sage, right? Or John Dominic Croissant, that Jesus is the Jewish peasant cynic. Or, by the way, he's the co-chair of the Jesus Seminar. I'm not going to go so much into Croissant and Borg, but you will get a little taste of them, or a little taste here. All right, so I have several videos for you that hopefully I still have for you. You can click on, if they're on the slides, they're still there. They're by N.T. Wright and Marcus Borg, and they're two different views of the quest. So relax, enjoy. You're almost done with me. So take a break. You can either look at those now or look at them when I'm done. I just will say, just have a final couple words to say. So in regards to the quests, watch those videos. Now, that takes me to what I promised you, which is, what does this look like now? So I have the Gospel according to the Jesus Seminar. You know, how is it that we can get to the authentic and true sayings of Jesus? Well, it's still being looked at from a particular lens. Now, that lens is still, if you look at John Hick and others, miracles never happened. There is no incarnation in the sense of like the virgin birth, or the incarnation in terms of the divine becoming human. Did I say miracles? Well, anything, again, that doesn't fit with what we know happens today, right? Now, if you go back and you try to say, here's what is authentic in the gospel accounts, but you've already a priori dismissed all these things which you decide could not be authentic to start with, which was a criticism even earlier, right? That was made, which you end up creating a fifth gospel. This is what you end up with. And this is current. This is contemporary. All right, look at this. This is Matthew 6:9-13. Now, when they go through the Gospels, and you can get the Jesus Seminar Gospels if you like, where this is how they rate the authenticity of a statement. Red, Jesus undoubtedly said it, or something like it. Pink, Jesus probably said something like this. Gray, Jesus did not say this, but the ideas contained in it are close to his. Black, most certainly Jesus never said that. No. It represents the perspective or context of a later or different tradition. So, this is the Matthew chapter 6, 9-13, according to the Jesus Seminar. Instead, you should pray like this. Our Father in the heavens, your name be revered. Impose your imperial rule. Enact your will on earth as you have in heaven. Provide us with the bread we need for today. Forgive our debts to the extent that we have forgiven those in debt to us. And please don't subject us to test after test, but rescue us from the evil one. So basically, the only thing that most certainly positively could be attributed to Jesus is our Father. All right, there you go. They also are using that criterion of dissimilarity, which we saw is a carryover of the New Quest. So we see Jesus as distinct vis-a-vis the early church tradition. So again, like I said, if it cuts against the grain of the listeners, then it must be Jesus. Jesus as a violator of the law and a party animal. Why did I say that? Oh, I don't know if I should tell you the story because I know you're so tired and you're so ready to take a break. But when I was at UCSB, and I took classes in when I took classes at UCSB on religion. I have a degree in economics, and I also have a degree in religions, religious studies. When we studied all the other religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, basically they just tried to teach what is it that this religion believes. It wasn't a critique on whether or not it made sense to believe those things. They just simply presented what it was that believers typically thought, except for Christianity, which ended up being a critique on Orthodox Christianity. And I remember once the professor was saying that when Jesus is being questioned because he hangs around with tax gatherers and all sorts of people that a good Jewish rabbi shouldn't hang around with, and Jesus says, "I've come not for those who are well, but for those who are sick." Forgive my paraphrase. He said, well, Jesus was just justifying his behavior because he was a party animal. And I thought, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding. And I at our small groups sessions, I said to the TA, I have a question about that. When I read the account, I don't get the party animal thing in that account. And this is his response to me. He said, "Are you a Christian?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You need to learn to put aside your bias." And I was stunned. I was just a dumb undergrad. I wasn't even really good at questioning. Well, maybe I did question authority. But at that moment, I knew that I had to critique everything that I was being taught. Because clearly people come with assumptions to whatever it is that they teach, and that includes me. That is why I told you, critique your teachers here, critique me, critique your other professors, because all we're doing is presenting the best of what we know at that time, and I guarantee you that I am wrong about something. I like to think I'm always right, but history has taught me that I'm growing and learning, and in 10 years, as I said before, I will know something differently than I know now. So my point is, what's interesting is I ended up reading an article that is critiqued, especially they used the word party animal, and I was like, oh, that wasn't my imagination. I remembered that well. So, all right, some other points. Basically, the Jesus Seminar rejects 82% of the sayings of the tradition as authentic. And it was Berger Pearson who had an excellent critique of this. And you don't have to read him. When I read it, I went, yes, that was exactly my experience at UCSB. I just didn't know there was a name for it. I didn't know that the professor from Harvard was working within the classical liberal tradition. I didn't have names for what I was. I didn't even know that I was an evangelical until I went to seminary. I didn't know that there were titles that went with the way that people thought. So, interesting. Okay. Right. As a little side note, by the way, I'm a vineyard person. I go to another church here in Big Bear, but I've been with a vineyard for like 30-something years. I'm ordained in a vineyard. And many years later, I went back to some faculty, something or the other. I wasn't part of the faculty, but I was back at some event where I ran into this professor. And I asked him how things were going, and we started talking, and he was really worried about his son. He was afraid his son had gone into a cult. And I said, really, what kind of cult? And he goes, it's called the Vineyard. I was like, oh, there is God that has a great sense of humor. So anyway, last thoughts on liberal Christology. It tends to be very reductionist. As you already saw, the immanist worldview means it fails to see the link between the earthly ministry of Jesus and what Jesus was trying to preach about the kingdom of God. So basically, the Sermon on the Mount becomes reduced to an nice ethical moral teaching, rather than it matters that the kingdom of God is here and the kingdom of God is coming, and so forth. So anyway, in the words of Carcana, we end up not with Christologies, but we end up with Jesusologies. All right. Okay. Ta-da! You made it! Okay, don't forget to watch those videos, and I'll see you at the next session. And here comes my dog because he's so excited because I'm done. All right. Yeah, you want to say hi, Samson? You can hang up now. Come here, Samson. Say hi. Come here. Up, up, up. There. Okay, he says hi. All right. See you next time.